So, again, thanks for being here at this time. I think everyone are getting tired being in this big rally. Okay, so the topic is land use, induced land use change at the extensive and intensive margin. And I think Madhu made a great job and paved the way for me, and I can go probably easier. And I can present what I have in here for you. Let me just start with a graph that you saw it in Madhu's presentation. It is another style of presenting that. So the discussion of induced land use changes due to biofuel production was just begin 8 years ago. And the first paper that published was Searchinger, and he was arguing that if you convert corn, for example, to ethanol production, then it will generate lots of land use changes. And he was estimating that in order to produce 1,000 gallons of ethanol, then you need about 0.73 hectares of land, new land. This means that you have to convert forest or pasture land to cropland. So, and then after that paper published, then several people start using different models. And you can see some of those. FASM was used, and then they showed that the land use implication for corn ethanol is not that high. And then Hertel used the GTAP model, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. And he showed that something in range close to the FASM model. And then after that, we made several changes in the GTAP model. And we show that induced land use changes to ethanol production are not so high. So now the question is where those numbers are come from. Why we see this reduction and where those numbers are come from. So one of the models that's used frequently in this area, and that was the model used by the California Air Resource Board in order to determine the indirect land use change for biofuel production, was GTAP. So I can say that GTAP is the vehicle to calculate land use change emission for rulemaking at this point. Now, let me see which policy you have to follow. So as you can see here, when we saw the first work that done by Searchinger, we see that they estimated a large land use implication, why that's happened. And then when you see the other side, you see that a smaller number. And it's good to know what are the differences between these models that they generate these kind of results. So if you just look at the Searchinger assumption, you see that they basically assume if you produce any gallon of ethanol, for any gallon of ethanol, you need new land. There is no flexibility in the whole crop system, nothing, zero. This means that if you take their target, multiply by corn yield, and then convert that to a simple conversion factor of corn to ethanol, and then take into account the DDG production, you get the same number. This means that they did not need any economic model. The economic model was not taking into account any flexibility, no improvement in yield, no substitution between crops, no reduction in consumption of crops, none of those. So, and then you see that as we move forward in different papers, we show that no, that's not the case. If you produce more corn, if you use more corn for ethanol, then the price will go up. Farmers will respond to prices. Yield will go up. Consumer will consume less, and all of those factors will affect the land use change. So here I have a list of activities that we made to improve the GTAP model. It was a GTAP is for those who do not know GTAP. GTAP is a computable general equilibrium model. It simulates the whole world economy. All countries are there. And it has all products which we produce across the world. It's a big engine. It's a big model. So it was basically an energy environment model. And then a version of that was trying to incorporate land into GTAP. And then the first version of the GTAP-BIO model was generated in 2008 with a combination of the first two. And after that, we start improving the model. For example, we introduced responses of farmers to higher prices. We introduced the difference between productivity of new land versus productivity of existing land, and all of those kind of changes. We introduced substitution between feed in livestock industry in terms of response to higher DDG, and all of those. And the most recent change that we made, which I'm going to talk about, is the last item. So more recently, we see that, and as Madhu mentioned, why we use these models? Because 8 years ago, when we were talking about land use change, no one knows what's going to happen in future, right? So we just try to use these models. And then over time, when we saw more evidence coming from real world, then we try to adjust it. More recently, and before going to that, here I have highlighted the major factors that could affect land use change when we use a model. So the first one is reduction in consumption of feedstock in non-biofuel uses. For example, when we produce ethanol from corn, of course, we will see a reduction in corn consumption in livestock industry, for example. That's one item. Or reduction in consumption of non-feedstock crops, switching among different crops, shifting of land use in US to other countries. If you do not produce, for example, corn in here, some other countries can produce it, and then we will see land use change in those countries. And the other two important factors, which I showed them in here with red, are the responses to increase crop yield per hectare of harvested area. And the other one is to increase frequency of using cropland due to multiple cropping or cultivating of unused cropland. Most of the economic models are taking care of the black items more or less correctly. But I can say most of the models, or maybe all of them, are wrong on the last two items. So including GTAP. So more recently, we tried to fix those. And I'm going to explain why we are wrong on that and how we fix that. So first of all, look at the growth year, expansion in yield in different countries or regions here. I have 8 selected regions or countries here. The top countries, you see yield is growing really significantly in those countries. For example, you can see that's an index for yield. You see that it's increasing from 95 to 120. Same thing in EU, in Brazil. Look at Brazil from 95 to 155, big jump in yield in Brazil. China. And then we have some of other countries that yield does not change significantly, or they're just flat. They are not changing over time. And then the other one that you can see here, and this one is showing that in different countries, yield is responding in different ways to changes in price. Of course, some of that is not only price, but I can say a big portion of that could be changing prices, right? So, and now here I'm going to show you another set of graphs that they compare two pieces of information in each country. You can see the red line is showing available land. How much land do we have to produce crops? And the green one is showing total harvested area in each region. So as you can see here, that's a long time period, 2003, 2013. We have a big jump in biofuel production in that time period. You can see roughly there is no major change in harvested area in US, some fluctuations. And there is no major change in land cover. It's relatively flat. But you can see, for example, in Brazil or South America, both harvested area and cropland going up. And as you can see in here in the top figures, you see that available land always is higher than harvested area, and the difference is big. And that shows unused land. You have lots of unused land in the US, which Madhu mentioned some of those categories. We have CRP land, we have cropland, pasture, and other types of unused land. So, and look at the bottom graph. As you can see here, in some countries like India, their harvested area is much larger than their available land, and that's because of multiple cropping. You can see same thing in China. There are lots of double cropping in China. This means that some of their land are used for crop production more than one time. And the other thing, as you can see here, in some countries like in Indonesia or in Brazil, the ratio between harvested area and cropland is changing over time, meaning that now in Brazil, they are using more frequently in terms of reducing their unused land, rather than moving towards expansion in cropland. So most of the economic models are wrong on projecting these things. Okay. So what we did, we used the FAO data, and we bring these observations and modified our model to capture those. Okay. So that's a brief story of what I'm going to tell you. Okay. So intensification economic models are usually captured by yield, which is production per harvested area. Okay. So with no multiple cropping, or when there is no unused land, changes in harvested area and changes in cropland cover over time should be identical. If there is no multiple cropping, or if there is no unused land, if you need 1 hectare more land, you have to, if you harvest 1 more hectare of land, then you need 1 more hectare of cropland. So if that's the case, then changes in yield could represent changes in intensification. You are fine if that's the case. But as I showed you, that's not the case. So in the presence of multiple cropping, or when there is unused cropland, economic models which do not take into account these components fail to represent intensification correctly or accurately. So the existing economic model typically represent harvested area and assume changes in harvested area equal changes in cropland, including GTAP. Okay. So, so under this condition, these models overestimate land use implication of biofuel production, all of them, no exception. So what we did, I'm going to go, and I have 2 minutes, I'm going to extend it to 3 minutes to be able to show you more. What we did, we made a change in this model in a way that now we can take care of intensification in 2 ways. First of all, we take into account intensification varies across different countries in terms of response to prices. That's the first one you can see here. As you can see here is the yield changes between 2003 to 2013. We ranked them, and then we assigned a factor in each region which represent the responses to crop prices differently. And then, as I mentioned, the older version of the GTAP, assuming that change in land is equal to change in harvested area, we changed that assumption entirely. And now the model is going to use in a different way. So I'm not going to explain that much. But here you can see that we define a new parameter in the model which captures the link between harvested area and cropland based on actual observations. What's happened in real world? You can see that gamma, When gamma is 0, like China, any expansion in harvested area does not convert to expansion in cropland. But in a country like Malaysia or Brazil, a portion of that will be converted to conversion of land. And in some countries, all of the changes will convert to cropland. And then we run the GTAP model. And let me just show you here that these models are now projecting different figures. You can see here the older model, we're assuming that an expansion in corn ethanol from 2004 to 215 billion gallon is generating about 1 million hectare of land use change, meaning that we need an additional of 1 million hectare of land. And now the new model is just estimating half of that. And that is basically because of expansion in double cropping all across the world or using unused land. And then I'm not going to explain more than that, and then see what are the consequences of that for the emissions. So these are numbers that is currently, these numbers are close to what California is using, California Air Resource Board is using. And now these are results of the new model. And you can see there is a big difference between them. And that is only due to taking into account double cropping and also converting unused land to crop production in response to ethanol production. So I'm going to stop here. I have, and this is based on a 2004 database. Then I had more slides showing the changes for 2000 in terms of changing in the database. And you see another line of reduction will come in if you take into account those, which I'm going to stop here. And in case if there is question, then I will answer those questions. Thank you very much.